Hi, I'm Paul Peterson.
I'm Chris Sun Liu. This lecture is on modern federalism, and first we'll discuss the Commerce Clause. Professor Peterson, what powers does the Constitution give Congress with respect to regulating commerce?
Well, if you read what the Constitution says itself, it says, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes.
At first glance, the Commerce Clause seems straightforward enough, but we know that the Commerce Clause has long been a point of controversy in American history. Where does that controversy arise?
You know, it's in many ways the most important clause in the Constitution as things have developed. But the key word in the clause, the Commerce Clause, is the word among. What does it mean? Does it have the same meaning as between? Does Congress only have the power to regulate commerce between states? Or does it have the power to regulate commerce within a state?
And how has the court interpreted the word among?
Well, it has given it the definition of between. It has distinguished between interstate commerce and intrastate commerce. Interstate commerce means commerce between two or more states. Intrastate commerce is just the activities that take place within a single state.
When did this distinction between interstate and intrastate commerce first arise?
Well, the celebrated case that interprets this clause is U.S. v. Knight, decided in 1895. And the legislation passed by Congress that was under discussion in this case was the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act said that companies could not be monopolies. You couldn't have a single company owning an entire industry, because with monopoly power, you could have the chance to make monopoly profits, and the consumer would suffer. So that was the legislation. Well, you can imagine that large corporations didn't like to be told they couldn't create monopolies. So they challenged the constitutionality of the Sherman Act. And the Supreme Court considered this in the case of the Knight Company. And the Knight Company produced sugar, and produced sugar in the state of Pennsylvania. And it was getting a monopoly on the production of sugar throughout the United States. But the Supreme Court said, well, look at, it's just manufacturing sugar within one state. And the mere fact that it's shipping it around the world doesn't have any particular significance, because as long as it's doing all of the production within one state, the state of Pennsylvania, then it's not subject to the regulation of the Sherman Act. So all of a sudden, monopolies were allowed to continue their operations.
How long did this understanding of the Commerce Clause hold, and does the court ever modify its interpretation?
Well, it does change its mind, and it changes its mind during the 1930s, during the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the middle of the Depression. It's sometimes called the switch in time that saves nine, because there are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Actually, there's no reason why it has to be 9. There could be many more justices if the Congress wanted to do so, as the Constitution doesn't say anything about the exact number of justices on the Supreme Court. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was so angry at the Supreme Court, he said they were all octogenarians. And so he said, well, you know what? I'm going to appoint a new justice for everyone that's over the age of 65. I think it was 65. Maybe it was 70. But this is going to give him a chance to appoint 6 more justices to the Supreme Court, and all of a sudden he'd be able to control the court. Well, that created a tremendous outrage in the country, and the president had to back away from that. And today it's inconceivable that we would ever have anything other than 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Well, one of the factors that helped resolve the problem was 2 justices on the Supreme Court began to back away from their consistent declaration of New Deal legislation, Roosevelt administration legislation, unconstitutional, and began to find ways of interpreting the Constitution that allowed this legislation to go forward. And the case at hand was the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company. Now, the National Labor Relations Board had been established by the National Labor Relations Act, which was a piece of legislation that gave rights to trade unions, to labor unions. And this board is still in existence today. It still pronounces on the relationships between companies and their workers. But the question is whether or not that legislation that created the National Labor Relations Board is actually constitutional, and whether it has the power to regulate the kinds of things that it was supposed to do. That is to say, tell companies that they had to allow unions to form within their company. And so the Jones and Laughlin Steel Company filed a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court. And in this lawsuit, they said, look, we make steel, but we make it all here in the state of Indiana. And so we're just operating within one state. We're not engaged in interstate commerce. The federal government cannot regulate the activities of a steel company that's operating within a single state. Well, Charles Evan Hughes, one of the justices who switched in time, writes the opinion and says, when industries organize themselves on a national scale, how can it be maintained that their industrial labor relations constitutes a forbidden field into which Congress may not enter? So the definition of what is interstate as distinct from intrastate changes with this decision.
After this early decision in the 1930s, does the Commerce Clause continue to grow and expand?
Yes, there's a great case in the 1940s that involves growing crops. There was a farmer who was feeding corn to his hogs, and he was told that the agricultural department forbid him from doing so because he was going to affect the international price of corn. Because if he was feeding his corn to the hogs, then he wouldn't be buying corn on the open market, and therefore the price of corn would fall. And this was in violation of the Agriculture Adjustment Act. And so well, the question really was whether the Agriculture Adjustment Act was constitutional, because that law gave the power to the federal government to regulate a lot of control over each and every farmer. And the Supreme Court, by this time totally filled with Roosevelt appointees, said, oh yes, they can do that. In fact, they can do just about anything they want. So we get with this decision a tremendous expansion of the power of the federal government.
Can you give me an example of a major piece of legislation that was justified under the Commerce Clause?
Yes, actually this case about the farmer is a pretty trivial case, but there's some big cases that have been decided by the Supreme Court that have made use of this expanded definition of the Commerce Clause, and the most important is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We're going to be talking about the Civil Rights Act in more detail later on, but it was one of the issues that came up with the Civil Rights Act was whether or not Congress had the power to tell businesses in each and every town that they could not discriminate against people of a particular race or religion. And the only way in which Congress could imagine that they would have the authority to do this was to rely upon this very broad definition of the Commerce Clause. So without this broad definition of the Commerce Clause, it's hard to imagine how we could have a constitutional Civil Rights Act that was so important for the creation of the society in which we live today.
Now, has the court put any brakes on the Commerce Clause?
Well, after the Civil Rights Act was passed, it was thought the Supreme Court is just going to allow anything and say anything can be done by Congress. But no. In the 1990s, in the case U.S. v. Lopez, the Supreme Court begins to place some limits on the expansion of the Commerce Clause. And the case involves Mr. Lopez, who is going to school in Texas, and he's carrying a gun with him. Now, he's not going to murder anybody. He's just, he likes his guns and he goes hunting. And so he brought his gun to school. I think he actually forgot that he had the gun in his knapsack. And so he is in violation of a federal law that Congress had passed, saying that if you come within 500 feet of a school building, you're going to be in violating a federal law. Now, there's lots of other laws that prevent students from bringing guns to school. You don't have to have a federal law. But members of Congress like to pass laws whenever there's a problem out there, and there were some problems. There were kids getting killed in school. And so Congress passed a federal law in an area that had been traditionally left to the states. So Mr. Lopez files a lawsuit to the Supreme Court when he has been indicted under a federal law, saying, no, you can't convict me under federal law. You could have convicted me under state law, but you didn't do that. You're trying to convict me under federal law. And that law is not constitutional. And so the case goes to the Supreme Court, and Chief Justice William Rehnquist says, Congress may not use a relatively trivial impact on commerce as an excuse for a broad general resolution of state and private activities. Now, in this case, there was a gun that had been purchased on the open market and had been manufactured in a different state. So wasn't there some interstate commerce here? Well, Rehnquist conceded there was some interstate commerce, but he said it's relatively trivial, and therefore you can't use that as a justification for passing this particular piece of legislation. Now, many people thought that Lopez was going to open up a new day where Congress was going to go, where the Supreme Court was going to go back to the old days of declaring many laws of Congress unconstitutional because they involved regulation of intrastate commerce. But that really hasn't happened.
The Lopez case involved a fairly minor piece of federal legislation. The implications were important, but the case itself was fairly minor. Did it pave the way for a more important Supreme Court decision? Are there any limits to the Commerce Clause?
Well, that's the case of Sebelius. And the Sebelius case involves Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And one of the issues that came up in that case was, can you regulate inactivity? Okay, so it's clear that the Commerce Clause gives the federal government the power to regulate activity. Any activities, almost any activities, Lopez being the one exception. So with this very broad definition of the Commerce Clause, does it include the power of Congress to tell people you must do something? You must buy health insurance. You can't get along without health insurance. Does Congress have that power? And it was argued before the Supreme Court that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional because Congress was regulating inactivity. And the Supreme Court agrees. So you get in Sebelius a decision that says there's some things Congress can't do. It cannot regulate inactivity. Now, does that mean the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional? Well, no. It is constitutional, but it's constitutional not because of the Commerce Clause, but because of the Taxing and Spending Clause. So that raises the question, what's the power of Congress to tax and spend?
We will explore that in the next part of this lecture.